Well, as everyone knows by now, I think, unless you're joining us for the first time, we are the Knoxville History Project, and our mission is to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. And we enjoy doing it every day, every week. We also want to put a plug out for our latest book. If you're a $100 and above donor, you should have got this end of December, rather. But what's also for sale, it's available at Union Avenue Books. It's got stories by myself, story on Carlos Campbell. Jack's got a couple of stories about the Kanzler family in the 1800s and Knoxville's World's Fair. World's Fairs before 1982. Laura Still is with us today. Did a story for us on Eleanor Wiley, which Jack helped a little bit on. And Paul Brown did a story on Charles Coburn, the actor, which you may have seen, the monocled actor from you may have seen in the 50s. He was on at least one Marilyn Monroe film. And our also another regular author, along with Laura, is Eric Dawson, who did a story on Sam Orleans and his remarkable film career. So look out for that. It's on our gift shop and also at Union Ave Books as well. Are the only two places. Also in Bed and Books in Sequoia Hills. Like I say, every month, we definitely encourage you to sign up and do a walking tour with Laura. She's eager every week to have you come and join her. So log on to knoxvillewalkingtours.com and sign up to join Laura around town. Also want to thank the Arts and Culture Alliance for helping us secure a grant through the City of Knoxville and the Department of Treasury for this series through the end of June. And that's it for me today. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you again soon. Jack?
Thanks a lot, Paul. We're going to be talking about church architecture this evening, and I hope that Christine Cloninger is getting better as we speak. I was looking forward to having her as our special guest tonight, but she's sick, and I prefer not to do it, as I would have too. But we fortunately had another presentation kind of ready to go. So, and this is a subject that's pretty fascinating to me. I've given tours on this subject, church architecture in downtown Knoxville, and it continues to fascinate me, and I've learned more in preparing this talk. But we'll be talking about kind of the history of church architecture. Amazingly, we know that there are 6 or so churches downtown Knoxville today. There have been about 40 church buildings in all over the years, and most of them are gone without a trace. And we'll be looking at many of those images. But let's look at the first picture, Paul. Yeah, this is this great picture that Paul found of Knoxville. This one of the earliest pictures, skyline pictures of Knoxville that we've ever seen. Maybe a little bit idealistic, but it's roughly mid-19th century, and you see some church spires in this picture over on the left side. But it kind of gives you a sense of this image of this town as it was in the mid-19th century. Next one, please. But there are some surprises in Knoxville church history. That we were actually slow to start building churches. In fact, this guy is Samuel Carrick, and you've seen his grave because it's on State Street. It's right behind the Tennessee Theater. This is the guy that founded both the first church in Knoxville, the First Presbyterian Church, and also the University of Tennessee. He founded as Blount College, of course, but he was a minister, a Presbyterian minister here in Knoxville, but he never saw a church built in his adoptive hometown. He was from Pennsylvania, and this was a matter of some astonishment to some. A Presbyterian minister came here in 1811 from Pennsylvania after Carrick's death. Carrick never saw a single church building built here. And 1811, a guy named Samuel Ramsey came to Knoxville and said he was appalled. He said, "This may be the only capital city in the world that has not a single place of worship." And that was the state of things back then. It was a very practical city. We had a dance hall, we had a lot of other things, but not a church. And that just hadn't been a top priority during the city's first 25 years. But it was in 1811, 1812 that a few people, Presbyterians, got together to build a church, a very simple church, only 50 feet long. It was the very first Presbyterian church. And it was there, that was the main church here for a while. Very soon, about the same time, a Methodist church was built just on the east side of town. So this was the beginning of church architecture, very simple in the Protestant tradition, very simple buildings that we don't have images of because they probably were so simple that no one thought to ever draw them. But they were, but that's how it began, is very simple little buildings that were just good for meetings on Sunday, and that was about it. Next one, Paul. Okay, this was the first substantial First Presbyterian Church, built in between 1852 and 1855. There was another substantial church built by this time, actually a couple of them, and we'll see pictures of them later, but we're staying within the denominations for the purpose of this talk. This is the church that was actually where the first Thanksgiving event that we know of ever in Knoxville history was an ecumenical service in this church in 1856. But this was the church that was taken over by the Union Army during the Civil War, and was used first as a stable, and then later as a school for black children who had been freed from slavery. That was, but it was retaken by the church, First Presbyterian Church, in 1866, and run by and Laura's right, the first one was called the Brick Meeting House. That's the one thing we know about it. But it was this was the church that was here for about 50 years, beginning in 1855 up until the early 20th century. But James Park was the pastor of this church, and remarkably, his father had been one of the co-founders. Father was an Irish immigrant, was one of the co-founders of the First Presbyterian Church. James Park had seen all three churches that were ever built on this property, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later. But he's the guy that came back and established the church in this building after the Civil War, when it was a wrecked building and there was talk of tearing it down. But they decided to reinstate the First Presbyterian Church and bring it back. Next one, please. There was a big effort in the 1890s, and we see this written up in 1899. I believe this is a story about the history of the church and the fact that Reverend Park was talking about building a modern structure, which is what we know today as the First Presbyterian Church as it is. He enlisted Bowman Brothers to build it. This was a well-known architectural firm here, I guess our first real architectural firm in Knoxville. We'll hear more about the Bowmans later. This Bowman spelled the German way, Baumann. They were sons of German immigrants who had come here in the earlier part of the 19th century, but well-known architects here in town. Next one, please. We'll see what they came up with. This is the church they built. And this is the First Presbyterian Church as we know today. You might not recognize it completely because it's got a lot of other stuff built onto it, but this is the church as it was. You notice there are Ionic columns that were, and this was a deliberate reference to the previous church. They wanted to make it look sort of like this previous church, which to me looked kind of, that earlier church looked kind of tomb-like almost to me, but this looks less so. With a little bit more classical design, and of course the stained glass windows. There are Tiffany windows, and among those stained glass windows in this church, and still are today. The columns, they talked about amending the original bill for the church, which I think was $28,000 to build this church back then. Of course, adjusted for inflation, that's complicated to do, but the committee went back and actually tried to amend the design to make it a little bit cheaper so they could afford it better. I think perhaps one of the amendments was that they made the columns mostly of wood rather than marble. They're painted to look like marble. But one interesting thing about that I didn't realize was that they used the column pedestals were taken from the previous building. and as Laura says, the rock is still there. That rock was, as anybody knows the New Testament knows that that Jesus called his servant, which one? It wasn't Thomas. He built the church upon the rock of one of his disciples, and they kind of took that, Peter, of course, St. Peter. They built the church, I think, almost literally on the rock. The very first church that was built here was on the corner and was built on that rock. But the rock was exposed in this construction of the church. Interestingly, there was discussion of keeping the original church building, the one we just saw the picture of, because it was about 6 feet away from the new church building. They thought, why not keep this old one? But they realized that the grading of Church Avenue, that the level of Church Avenue was below the foundation of the old church, and I thought this is a significant collapse hazard here. So it's a lot safer to just tear this church down, and they did that in late 1902, and just leaving the brand new church behind it. One interesting thing about that church when they tore it down was that they exposed the grave of James White, which was later moved over to the other part of the graveyard. Anyway, this church was interesting thing. Was added on to with another thing I should mention. The back of the church was, you see that part on the right was an additional part of the church that was used for Sunday schools, and this was a new idea that kind of informed the way churches were being built across denominations. Sunday schools, and not just the Sunday meeting, were becoming part of the church life, and the Sunday school included a big chapel in which all the Sunday schools would meet and kind of some breakout rooms around that. But the church, the latest version of this church, they did a major addition to this church. And in that addition, in just a few years ago, they exposed this old angular addition to the church that was built in with this church in 1902. And it's kind of an interesting feature that's just a wall between rooms in the church as it is today, but you can go down there this Sunday and have some coffee and look at the original wall that they kind of exposed as it had not been exposed before. What else to say about this? In 1924, remarkably, James Park, the guy who'd grown up with his church and who'd seen all versions of it, turned 80 years old as they were completing this church. And he was the first minister to give a sermon in this church. He lived another 10 years or so, lived a long time, but was the first guy to ever give a sermon in this room, and was this guy who had an amazing span of life that encompassed most of the first century of the history of this church. He lived, of course, in the James Park house, which is still standing on Cumberland Avenue, and that was where he was born and where he died 90 years later. Next one, please. All right, you can see the graveyard here. I'm not talking about the graveyard tonight. This is about architecture, but that graveyard has a lot of stories in it. Some of these graves were shuffled around over the years as they built different churches, different church additions. You see the northern wing of this church in the back. That was built in 1924, designed by a very well-known Nashville firm, Dougherty and Gardner. Dougherty and Gardner are led by Edward Emmett Dougherty, are best known for Nashville's War Memorial Building. If you probably know that building in Nashville, one of the premier buildings of that era. They were also here designing another building called First Baptist. We'll be talking about that later, but I can't tell whether they came here to work for First Baptist or to work for First Presbyterian, but they built the whole of First Baptist. But these wings, that symmetrical wings on either side of the church, for First Presbyterian, which were housed offices and Sunday school rooms mainly. So that was a major and pretty, to me, pretty attractive addition to the church. All right, next one, please. Here's the church as we see it today. By the way, those wings I just mentioned were more obvious before a 1960s edition of the chapel. But this, you can kind of see a lot of historians could guess the era of this church, kind of the very end of the Beaux-Arts sort of period, but with 1901 design, 1902 construction. Next one, please. And here's another picture of the churchyard. Obviously, next one. All right, there was a schism in the Presbyterian Church that had to do with some theology I won't get into right now, but also some practical issues like pew rentals, which was an issue for the early folks. This is the second Presbyterian Church as it was built on Market Street near Market Square. You see that, notice the stepped facade, that was a feature of it. And the two doors, that was traditional in the mid-19th century to have a door for men and a door for women. They sat in different parts of the church in those days, just to be proper. The Second Presbyterian Church was built finished in 1820, has an interesting belfry there. This is the church that was associated with Reverend Stephen Foster, the guy that was famous. He was a physics professor and a Presbyterian minister, but he was famous for his experiments in galvanism and the famous story about the corpse that was electrified in this laboratory experiment. You can read more about that in Laura's book or in some of mine as well. But that was a fascinating experiment that took place in the sanctuary of this church, apparently. And people boosted themselves up to look through the transoms to see what was going on in there. Anyway, this church was there for about 40 years. There's only one, I've only seen one photograph of it. And we have that in the next one as a photograph in the background of a pretty famous picture of Knoxville. If you see, of course, the white step facade of the church back there, this is really when Market Square was brand new, and you see the Market House over to the right. That's the original Market House, and that's where Market Square was slowly developing at that time. But this picture was taken in 1859, about a year before this church was torn down. So this is, I'm sure, the last and maybe the only picture of the second Presbyterian church. So it was torn down to build a larger building. And this is a fascinating picture. Thomas Smiley, who was from New Hampshire, I believe, or Vermont, I think, moved down here and didn't expect to stay, but ended up being our resident photographer, and is buried at Old Gray. Next one, please. Here's the church they built to replace it, and this is the Second Presbyterian Church as it was known, and you can see that in the background. You can see part of the Kern building that's there today. To place yourself, this is basically where Home Federal is now, and behind it is the Arnstein building, which was built on what had been the Second Presbyterian Church graveyard behind the church. This church was much larger, dedicated November of 1860. And there was a nearby chapel that was built of bricks from the original building, the 1820 building, and they used the chapel as well. They were here for about 40 years, and they decided to move because of the growth of the church. And in 1905, they had a farewell service by Reverend Bachman, and in 1907 moved into what became known as the Walnut Street Church, which was built just a couple blocks away. Before we go there, this is in the early 1870s. The construction of the Custom House, which was of course not a church, but you can see two key churches in the background. The Second Presbyterian Church we just saw a picture of is on the right, and on the left is a very interesting church called First Methodist Episcopal. First Methodist was called the New Methodist Church, or the Northern Church. There was a schism at the time of the Civil War, and First Methodist was the Union Church, and this is the church that Parson Brownlow favored, and the one that he helped found. Parson Brownlow by this time was governor of Tennessee. He was no longer mainly a preacher, but he did give some sermons in that church building. That church building has a really interesting story we'll get into a little bit later, but just wanted to show this picture juxtaposing Second Presbyterian and First Methodist as they were right across the street from each other in the early 1870s. Next one, please. Okay, this is the one of the amazing churches that people see and can hardly believe that they were there and that they're completely gone now. This was built in 1907, the Walnut Street Church, it was called. It's been attributed to an architect named Isaac Purcell of Philadelphia, and who was 1853 to 1910. Had a Gothic tower with clarion bells, Tiffany windows as First Presbyterian had, but an amazing, impressive church. By this time, churches are no longer, even Protestant churches are no longer simple. Before the Civil War, churches are all kind of boasted of their Protestant simplicity. By the late 19th century, early 20th century, they were getting elaborate and Gothic. Gothic just was a great celebration of sometimes asymmetry and Gothic arches with the peaks in the middle, but just these churches that were kind of inspired by ancient European cathedrals, and that was what the Second Presbyterian Church looked like from 1907 to the 1950s. But you see, this was where the Lost Community Library is now. This was on the kind of on the corner on the eastern end of the library area. And you look around, there are houses, and there are townhouses and set apart houses, and it's kind of this is kind of the beginning of the residential area of downtown Knoxville. So this was, but this is a great stone church building that you think would last for the centuries, and it's just there's no trace of it there today. It was once had a parsonage connected to it. By the way, Purcell is best known for his work in Philadelphia, and also for a church still standing in Charleston, West Virginia, called St. John's Episcopal. Parking became a problem for them in the 1940s, and also they noticed that a lot of their new members had homes in the suburbs, and they said maybe we should think about moving to the suburbs. This first proposed in 1948, when this church was only about 40 years old. They were saying maybe downtown is not the place to have a church, a big church like ours. And it was in 1957 that they bought some property and built a church on Kingston Pike, the one we know today, designed by Charlie Barber of Barber and Murray, one of his later creations. But this originally church was not torn down after St. Presbyterian left. It was a congregational church for a few years, and it was even used by Webb School before Webb School had a permanent campus out west, before it was turned down, I think, in the 1960s, and before they built the library, this church was gone. Anyway, next one, please. All right, we're getting to the Methodists, and I'm finding the Methodists had a lot of different. Okay, this is another Second Presbyterian Church picture here. Yeah, this from that era. All right, and here's the old East Main Methodist Church. It's pretty simple. This is a church that was probably late Victorian, but it was on the site of the first Methodist, very first known Methodist church, which was a very simple building. As I said, the idea was to have a very simple, small building, and that was what your church was. They didn't really have any architectural pretensions in the early 1800s in Knoxville for churches. But this is a later church on that site of East Main. This was over near where the hotel was later built. That was that hill where the Hyatt Regency, which has been a different hotel since then, and now I think is a dilemma of some sort. That was called Methodist Hill, and this church was built the first church there, not this one, was built in 1816, the same year that the Presbyterians built their first permanent chapel. So this is just a later chapel that was on that site. But by the early 19th century, the Methodists were moving over to Church Avenue. And we have a picture of that next, I think. Is that right, Paul? Yeah, this is not the first church that they built on Church Avenue. And the naming of Church Avenue is a little bit of a puzzle, because I'd always heard it was named for the Methodist churches, the impressive Methodist churches on the street, which had previously had another name. But Church Avenue was named a couple of years before the first church we know of on the first Methodist church we know of on Church Avenue. So this a little bit of a puzzle, but this is the later Methodist church they built on Church Avenue in the 1870s. I don't know that we know the name of this. Was a much beloved church to the people of what became Church Street Methodist. They loved the name of the church so much they carried it to another place even when they left Church Street. But this church named itself after the street in 1871. It had just been called the Methodist Church. But by this time there was a First Methodist Church that was the Northern Church. This was the Southern Church. But this was interestingly it backed up to that Northern Church we mentioned earlier. So they were kind of turned their backs to each other, whether deliberately or not, I can't say. But it was this was an impressive church that was here in the 1870s. Dedication services in 1878. The design has been attributed to a guy named Alexander Campbell Bruce, who is a Nashville architect, and he designed this when he was still in Nashville, just before he moved to Atlanta. He became a pretty well-known architect after this. But this church was a kind of vine-covered church, very Gothic, and there's something about the Methodist Church about this time in the mid-19th century that became kind of the hallmark of Methodist churches. They began designing churches in the Gothic style, and they began recommending plans for churches from the national organization. The Methodist Church has a tighter knit national organization than a lot of Protestant churches do, and they began pushing the idea of impressive architecture and Gothic architecture that kind of is a little bit often a little bit asymmetrical and kind of makes people stop and look. It's kind of something you really can't take in a quick glance. Gothic architecture is something that makes you want to look and say, how can that be there, or why is that over there? And I think that's one of the reasons that this was considered appealing for church architecture. Now, in many ways, Knoxville at this time was very pragmatic. When we built office buildings or factories, there sometimes has some decoration, but churches were really what allowed architecture to flourish. Church architecture. They wanted to build something impressive that would last for the ages and be impressive and help launch people into the next world, maybe. But this was a much beloved church for a long time. It was there for about 50 years, and was so beloved they kept the name many years later, even though at Church Street it was no longer on Church Street. Next one, please, Paul. This church had been in the early 1920s. They started saying that we're outgrowing this church. We may need to build a new one. And then in 1928, it caught fire, and there was a devastating fire, as you can see. And you just see that beautiful architecture was nearly completely ruined. I don't know if we would try to save some part of that if that happened today, but this was the result of that fire. And it was at this time that the church kind of moved around, actually stayed with met at some other churches and in theaters like Staub's Opera House before they as they were building a new church. And this was an impressive and especially impressive new church, maybe the most impressive building ever built in Knoxville. And that's what I think have next. Is that right, Paul? Yeah, this is the Church Street Methodist, ME Church, Methodist Episcopal Church, as it was called back then. They later just opted for calling themselves Methodist to keep, I guess, keep from confusing themselves with Episcopalians. But this is a classic Gothic church. It's attributed to two architects, and we know that they both worked on it. One was Charlie Barber, who I think was everybody's favorite architect at this time. Charlie Barber was building lots of Gothic architecture around town. About the same time that he was building this, he was designing designing this building. He was designing the YMCA just down the street, which has some hallmarks of Gothic architecture, and kind of a medieval looking place to do your workout. But also Hoskins Library was built about the same time, designed and built about the same time at UT campus, which is a really extraordinary Gothic building. And also Alumni Memorial Auditorium at UT. Charlie Barber designed all those things. And in this Gothic style, which has the arches and the stonework, and in some cases the asymmetry that you associate with Gothic styles. It's a particular kind of sandstone they used in the construction of this church. But he had another architect who worked with him, a very famous guy, a guy named John Russell Pope, who was based in New York, but most famous for his work in Washington. He designed the Jefferson Memorial, among other things, in Washington. What else? The Porter Gallery, lots of big monumental buildings in Washington. And people have argued and speculated and wondered which architect had more to do with this building. Some people insist that John Russell Pope did, that this is similar to other churches that he had done, even though it's not very much like the classical architecture he did in Washington. But other people say this is Charlie Barber's ideal project. This is kind of his dream project, and I think he was a member of this church. But they, I think, both would be proud to claim this building. It's just an astonishing building that has served a lot of purposes in Knoxville, other than being the Methodist church. The very first performance of the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, when Bertha Roth Walburn Clark founded it in 1935, was here in this building. And it says something that's still used for a Big Ears Festival. I've seen Bella Fleck and other people perform in the same room where the KSO performed in 1935. And also opera has been conducted in there. They had a performance of Tosca that Knoxville Opera did a few years ago, an act of it in that building. But a really impressive building. I'm really glad that we have not torn down this church, and it's been there for 90 years now. One interesting thing about the church, a couple of interesting things. One is the stonemason was an Italian guy with the unusual name of Taliaferro Yon, Y-O-N. He was from the northern part of Italy, which had some Germanic influence. That might explain his unusual last name. But he was an Italian-speaking stonecutter, as a lot of the stonecutters of this era were. But his wife was Italian too, and she loved to cook for people, and she began what may have been the first Italian restaurant in Knoxville on Cumberland Avenue, not very far from this church. But he moved here just to work on this church, and this happened to several Italians. They came here to work on one building, ended up spending the rest of their lives here. But that was that he was the stonecutter. Another interesting thing about this church is that the contractor was a guy named Charles Gervin, who was one of the biggest projects in Knoxville history, this contracting job. And all these big pieces of rock were lying around with numbered about how they were going to be assembled together on the church in 1930. When a guy drove up, got out of his car and shot him and killed him, the chief contractor, right on the church grounds. It turned out that the assailant had blamed Gervin for the collapse of his marriage, and was trying to get vengeance for that. And he was arrested and put away again. But it was that's a kind of a strange story. They had to get another contractor to finish it. But another thing, and we'll move on to the next one. Hugh Tyler, a well-known mural artist, stencil artist, who had worked with Charlie Barber on other projects, including the Hoskins Library, did a lot of the interior painting work in the church. And Hugh Tyler is is notable for the fact that that he's the uncle of James Agee. And if you've read A Death in the Family, he's the artist who's referred to, the Uncle Andrew, the artist that he refers to. But this is that's a lot of interesting stories about the construction of this building, and it's 90 some years old now, and we're lucky it's still there. Next one, please, Paul. All right, I want to come back to this slide because you see First Methodist Episcopal. This is one of the few photographs I know of the First Methodist Church. It was used there in that location for about 30 years. And unlike other churches, it was not torn down. It was sold and used for other purposes. In fact, it was a livery stable for a while after it was sold in the early 1890s. And it was developed all around it. It was developed so much that there was so many facades of other businesses, including a drugstore and lots of little shops and things, that people forgot the church was even back there until it burned down in 1861. Actually, the whole block of businesses burned down. And as soon as some burned down, the church was slower to burn than the other things were. And people said, gosh, there's a church back there. And there were some pictures in the newspaper of this steeple rising above all these burned out businesses. It was a completely forgotten steeple that was back there. Only the old timers knew what it was. But this old First Methodist Episcopal, the old Northern Methodist Church. But it was replaced in 1893 with a pretty impressive church. This was we have a picture of that next, Paul, right? Yeah, this is a church that was, and this one of the amazing churches that you can hardly even imagine was there. This was at Clinch and Locust. This is basically where the Hilton parking garage is today. This massive church that looks like it should last for 1,000 years was not there for a full century, but it was built in 1893. I'm trying to remember who. I don't think I ever figured out who the designer was. Who might has any idea about that? They designed it on what they call the Akron plan, which is something the Methodist Church used. It was a plan that put the sanctuary of the church in one place and had Sunday school facilities in another place. Sometimes had a tower like this, but another Gothic style church, really just massive church that looks medieval. That was right diagonally across the street from Charlie Barber's YMCA at that time, but it was there for a good long time. It was one interesting thing. They had their first service on Easter of 1894, and moved the contents of the cornerstone of the previous church, which included some coins and so forth, into the cornerstone of this church. It had a thick stone tower, anyway, but had an emphasis on room for informal Sunday school gatherings. 1,500 person capacity in the sanctuary of this church. This was, by the way, William Rule's church, Captain Rule, who was the well-known editor and twice mayor of Knoxville, one of the most admired people of his day, and one of the most admired people to historians. You can't find very much to complain about him. He was a very thoughtful and progressive and forward-looking guy. I wish we had more leaders like that. But anyway, this church, they decided, just like the Second Presbyterians, that they could not stay downtown anymore and keep growing their church. So they put this property. They bought the Hugh Sanford property, which was architecturally interesting anyway, because it was a Harry Lindenberg designed house on Kingston Pike, where they designed a modern church kind of around it to some extent, to take the congregation of First Methodist and move it out to Kingston Pike. They sold the building, and it was purchased by somebody who frankly wanted to tear it down for parking. And that in 1965, that may have seemed to make sense, but that was they had their last sermon here at Christmas in 1965, was torn down just a few months later. There's no trace of it today. And I've asked, I don't know how many people remember this church, but it's I've been just I'm always surprised to look at old pictures of Knoxville that have this church kind of in the corner. It's just an amazing piece of construction. But anyway, next one, we're getting the Baptist church. And this is, the Baptists are a little bit surprising. The Baptists were founded by New Englanders, the Baptists in Knoxville. It was a couple of guys originally from New Hampshire. I think they lived in Boston, the Moses brothers. They met in the courthouse until they built a little, remember the Protestant idea of the very simplicity. They built a little one-room brick building on the 600 block of Gay Street. In those early days before the Civil War. It was very simple. They had benches with straight backs. They sound uncomfortable. And they had a Sunday school in the basement of that little building. But when the Baptists began growing in Knoxville in the mid-19th century and built a larger church, which kind of, I think, was a challenge to this church, this little church on Broadway. They called it Broadway Baptist Church in 1885. And I think that might have gotten the parishioners of First Baptist to say, maybe we ought to build an impressive building too. So they built a Gothic building here, again, asymmetrical with arches and all that, spires, and the tallest and most dangerous looking steeple I've ever seen on a church in Knoxville. That just kind of, I don't know, it looks terrifying to me somehow. I always picture myself being stuck up at the top of it and saying, figuring out how to get down. But but you can see that steeple in many old pictures of Knoxville between when it was built in 1886 and when it was torn down in the 1920s. Captain William Wallace Woodruff, who was the guy that started Woodruff's, we're familiar with the brew pub building. That was a hardware and furniture store, led the construction of this. At this time, it was directly south of the Mechanics Bank, which you see on the left there, and is still there. It was they had in 1921 they decided to build a new church. They had a lot of the original building committee from the 1880s. I don't know what they thought about this, to have built a building and 40 years later decided it's outmoded. We're going to build a new one and be on a building committee for a building to replace the building that you built as a young man. That was William Wallace Woodruff's dilemma. But they signed some contracts in 1922, found some land on Main Street, and hired that firm that I mentioned earlier, a Nashville firm called Dougherty and Gardner, and built a pretty impressive church with an unusual octagonal interior and Greek revival on the outside. Really impressive church, and real stone marble pillars on this church. This church, by the way, was my friend Paul Ashdown, I think, told me the story that he had Brendan Gill, the well-known New Yorker architecture critic, was in town, and Paul was driving him around town, and they were driving down Main Street, and Brendan Gill, New York architecture critic, said, "Wait, stop the car! I want to see this building." And he got out and just kind of rejoiced in it, beheld this building. He said, "It reminds me of Christopher Wren, the great English architect of the 1600s, who rebuilt London after the Great Fire." And there are churches that Christopher Wren built in the late 1600s that do, to some extent, resemble First Baptist Church in Knoxville. One extraordinary thing about First Baptist was the steeple. The steeple in 1924 was the site. If we can go back to that picture with a steeple on it, Paul, that had a radio tower in it, 1924. That was the modern thing for churches. They wanted to have radio towers because they were broadcasting to the world. And they had one of the first radio stations in Knoxville, not the very first, the second or third in town, was called WFBC, W First Baptist Church. And they had their tower in the steeple. They broadcast from the church and broadcast sermons and music and other things, all cleared at that time by the church authorities, of course. But anyway, an interesting and unusual virtue of a steeple is to be a radio tower. Next one, please. And here's another church kind of showing it on Main Street at a time that it was that Main Street was mainly residential and cars driving both ways, which they don't do anymore. Next one. And this was another picture of First Baptist, and Laura says it's modeled after St. Martin in the Field. I don't doubt it. On Trafalgar Square, I've been in that church. Next one, please. All right, this is the only known picture, and it's not a good picture because it's hard to complain about trees in full summer growth. But this is the only known photograph of the first Episcopal Church in Knoxville. This is St. John's Episcopal Church on the same corner where it is today, but this is the original brick building that was there in the 1840s. This was probably the first elaborate church building in Knoxville. We've seen a lot of other churches taking off on this later, but before the 1840s, all the churches in Knoxville I know of were very simple, small, little buildings like the old brick meeting house. But this was a church that was trying to look somewhat like European churches, and St. John's was proud of that. St. John's was founded by a group of English immigrants, including Joseph Wood, who was the grandfather of the writer Joseph Wood Crouch, and the grandfather and namesake of Crouch. It may have raised the bar for church construction in Knoxville. I think all the churches downtown after St. John's first church were beginning to try to look more like more extravagant European churches, especially, but not entirely in the Gothic style. This church was even before that older First Presbyterian church we mentioned and showed the picture of. But they rebuilt it in 1892. I think a much larger church and more elaborate church still, at church designed by an architect from Ohio named Joseph Yost, who is best known in Ohio. He did some work in New York as well. As far as I know, this church is his southernmost design. He never designed much in the South, but he designed this one. He's known for a few other buildings. The West New York Union Square building, which is a 21-story building at Park and 17th, and he designed that in 1911. But that's this church was expanded some over the years, expanded to the northwest with another building that's there today, a big rectangular building in 1910. But we pretty and interesting to look at church to this day, and I'm glad it's still there. So this is the church also associated with James Agee and a lot of other prominent Knoxvillians. Color picture suitable for it was a postcard picture. And do we have another picture down Walnut Street, Paul? Is that the next one? Yeah, here we go. Here's some perspective on the St. John's is on the right, and that's Second Presbyterian's big Gothic church on the left, looking down the way, and all townhouses up and down the street. There was almost entirely residential Walnut Street at this time, and it's not all these buildings are gone except for St. John's today. Anyway, and here's another shot. They've of course added on to it in recent years with the maze-like thing, the labyrinth in the courtyard there. That's kind of fun to walk around. Next one, Paul. All right, here are the Catholic churches. The Catholics arrived here, especially from Ireland. And if you look at these people closely, they look like Irish immigrants, and they're standing in front of the first Catholic church ever built in East Tennessee. This was actually a church designed by a priest who had also been a celebrated artist. Father Henry Vincent Brown was the guy that designed this little chapel, and that was built in 1855, I think, and they called it the Rock Church. This was a time, 1855, the time of great duress for Catholics, because it was at the time of the Know Nothing Party, of which Parson Brownlow was a member. It was anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and there are stories that the Irishmen who were building this church were spat at with tobacco by guys who were, as they were digging out the foundation. But they successfully built this church and loved this church and occupied it until there got to be too many Catholics to fit in there in the 1880s. But and you can see the church they built right next to it. This is in 1885 that they built the next church. But they kept this church until they built an addition to the back of the church we know today. That was when they tore down this church in the 1890s. It was here, they coexisted for a few years, maybe 5 or 6 years until they had to tear this one down. But they say they saved some parts of this church in some aspects of the new church, including the retaining wall is said to be made of big stones from the old rock church. That was the first Catholic church in East Tennessee, the second Catholic church in the state of Tennessee. Next one, please. Yeah, this is the church that was built in 1885. The picture's from the early 1900s, but this was designed in 1885 by Joseph Bowman. Joseph Bowman was still a solo practitioner of architecture, our first, I think, full-time architect. And this is one of the rather few buildings that he designed by himself. He was not formally trained, but he learned enough on the job to be a pretty good designer. He designed this church in the Gothic style with a kind of an overlarge steeple, which was kind of typical of the Gothic style. It looks almost like it outweighs the rest of the church. But there are several interesting things about that steeple. One is that, the facade doesn't face toward downtown Knoxville. Most of the other churches we've looked at face toward the middle of town. This faces north of town. And why? Because it faced toward Irish town, the Irish community who formed most of their parishioners were to the north, and they could see this, and to this day you can see this church very clearly from down where the railroad station is, which is where the Catholics, the Irish Catholics, lived. And if you walk down there today, you can see very clearly. I understand it's possible that new architecture may obscure that view. I think that'd be a shame, but that's progress, I suppose. But anyway, this church, when it was obvious that this church's steeple was going to be seen from so many different parts of town, because it's built on a high hill. It's built up here where we are on Gallows Hill. This place, and the city had been struggling to come up with the money to build a town clock that could be seen from different places, and it was becoming a problem because there was not a clock down at the train station that was very clearly visible, and there was not a clock on Market Square. But here suddenly you have a place with so tall a steeple that you can build a clock into the steeple that you can see from Market Square and also from the southern train station. So they talked them into doing this and said, we'll take care of the clock. We'll help you build the steeple with money and install clocks up there and keep it running if you let us do this. And that clock is still there today. But that was the town clock for a while. That was not just the Catholic church clock. That was the town clock in the Catholic steeple. There are some interesting descriptions of this church in Cormac McCarthy's Suttree that we quote in our literary guide. By the way, pick that up if you haven't yet. But the stained glass windows that McCarthy describes, this was McCarthy's family's home church, were from Cincinnati and were shipped down here. But the clock idea, by the way, was a Councilman Samuel Rogers' idea, and it was the Howard Clock Company of Cambridge, Massachusetts, that supplied the clock. The altar was added on the back in 1891, and that was when they demolished the little stone church. And finally, this was I mentioned this was Joseph Bowman's project. I think it was a year or two later they began working with his much younger brother Albert, and it became Bowman Brothers. So that's when you hear Bowman Brothers. This is after 1886 or 7. Okay, next. Here's another. In the foreground, you see the same Catholic church with the old St. Mary's school. And I know some people who actually went to school there. That was the Catholic school for elementary school, even into the 1960s. So that was torn down in more recent years. But up on top of this is the Vine Avenue, right in the foreground, West Vine Avenue. Next one, please. All right, here's the front of it, and you really get a sense of the kind of the impressive facade of this building that you could see for a couple miles away, and remind yourself that it's time to go to mass. And on Christmas morning, Catholics with torches would parade up this hill to go to Christmas mass. Next one. All right, this is the Logan Temple AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church on Commerce Avenue, and this was claimed to be, when it was built in the 1880s, the largest church in Knoxville, the largest sanctuary in Knoxville. I can't prove that or disprove it, but it's plausible. It was so big that they had some big conventions, secular conventions, like the Afro-American League had their national convention in this building in 1892 or so, with a lot of African American leaders were part of that big meeting that they had. Anyway, it was there for a long time, and this was they had so many stories of major weddings and funerals in this church over the years. It was the African American church in Knoxville, especially for AME Methodists, but was an impressively big building. It was also built mostly of wood, and this was troublesome to some city inspectors in the 1950s, in the late 1950s. This was not in the urban renewal zone that things were being demolished for, but in the late 50s, about the same time as urban renewal was being proposed, some city inspectors went in there and said, this is a fire trap. And whether they would have said that for a white church or not is not for me to say, but they condemned it. They had to stop using it, but it wasn't torn down until the mid 1960s. And a lot of people, it was torn down at the same time that so much things were torn down for urban renewal that a lot of people assumed that it was the same, part of the same kind of swath of destruction. But this was an impressive building, and when they reported in the paper, in the white newspapers, this was the biggest church in Knoxville, people did not argue. I don't know very much about the architecture, but it was capable for useful for lots of things for about 70 years or so. So it was really a landmark in the history of the African American community. Next one, please. All right, this is an early, the Pilgrim Congregational Church. This was, I've been told that this church had some connections to French Swiss, but this was down at the corner of Henley Street and, let me see if I can, get to where I can see this better. Henley Street and Jackson Avenue. And this church was an interesting church. I think built in the 1880s, was used by this congregation until a few years later, and they decided that they wanted to use it. The Jewish congregation had gotten big enough. The Jewish congregation had been founded in the 1860s. The temple, what became Temple Bethel, decided they had the wherewithal to establish a permanent synagogue. And so this Pilgrim Congregational Church became the first synagogue in Knoxville. This was Temple Bethel for many years. It was right next to what became the first Arnstein Jewish Community Center, which was all on the west end of Vine Street. We don't have a west end of Vine Street anymore. This is not even a street anymore. This is I guess somebody considered it too steep or something, but it's now just developed away. And that church is long gone. But the Jewish community built their church on Kingston Pike, Temple Bethel, a very modern church, and a modernist church in the 1950s, and they moved from here. And this building was torn down not too long after that, I think. Next one, please, Paul. All right, here's an interesting oddity. This is the old People's Tabernacle. And if you know the building that is now the Theater Knoxville building, cinder block building down on Central Street, that has recently been various other churches, was originally the People's Tabernacle. It was built on the same property. The People's Tabernacle was established in the 1890s by an English missionary named Robert Bateman, kind of a missionary who went around and was kind of a reformer. Went back and forth between England and America. He lived here in Knoxville for several years, but he was in England looking at prison conditions in England when he happened to get on the wrong boat coming back to America in 1912. And the boat happened to be called the Titanic. Reverend Bateman, who founded this church, went down on the Titanic, and they say that he was the one that requested the band, maybe apocryphal, to play "Near My God to Thee" as the ship was going down. But there was a special service for Reverend Bateman here in 1912, and thousands of people came here. There was lots of they were singing, and they were singing that hymn, "Near My God to Thee," in this little church. But this was a People's Tabernacle. It was a missionary church, so it was built in was considered a dangerous part of town. And this was a part of town with a lot of whorehouses, cocaine parlors, saloons, and Reverend Bateman went right into the middle of it and opened this church that was meant to be of service to the poorest of the poor in Knoxville, down in the bottom area where it flooded a lot. But this is near the intersection of Central and Clinch, or Church rather. Nice one, Paul. All right, here's the German Lutheran Church on Broadway and Fifth Avenue. Now, get a good fix of this church in your mind, because we're going to look at something that resembles it later. But there were two Lutheran churches. The German Lutheran Church was called that because they spoke German in here. They had the services in German in this church. That was the early Lutheran Church. Of course, a lot of them were German immigrants. They brought their Lutheranism with them and established a Lutheran church, and saw no reason to speak anything other than German in church when they were all together. That was, and it was all German-speaking church until the 1917. You might imagine 1917 was a kind of an era of anti-German feeling, and people stopped, even German immigrants stopped trying to celebrate their German heritage as much as they had before. I think this church was built around 1870, but was there until 1903. Oh, I'm sorry, this 1903 church. There was a previous church we don't have a picture of. This church was built in 1903, had this unusual kind of interesting corner tower. But again, keep that image in mind, because we'll see it again later. And then there was an English very close by, within less than a stone's throw, was an English language church called St. John's Lutheran. Okay, here's the first. I'm sorry. The first Lutheran is the descendant of the German Lutheran Church, and this is today's First Lutheran Church on Broadway, and they've had German festivals celebrating their German heritage. But this is what the German Lutheran Church became in years to come. Next one, please. All right, here's what I was talking about. This is near where that old German Lutheran Church was. St. John's English Lutheran Church. They spoke English here, and it was built in the very early 1910s. I think maybe 1911 or something. It was built, and it was built in a very Gothic style, and was really remarkable in some ways, in that it really resembles a miniature version of a European cathedral. Its architect. His name was Richard Graff, was the architect of this building, and he was a well-known architect, not as well remembered by name as some architects, but he designed several interesting buildings around town. He designed the big Sturkey building on Gay Street, and the Journal Arcade, I believe. He designed that as well. But he designed this church. He also designed the little bandstand at Shelby Park that's still there. But he was born here, but son of Swiss immigrants. But pretty extraordinary version of a small 14th century cathedral with a rose window and the four spires. Graff had worked with George Barber, and that was kind of the beginning of his architectural career. But he This has been on the National Register of Historic Places since 1985. It was funded by Martha Henson, who was the widow of a shoe magnate. Haynes Henson Shoes was a big shoe manufacturer and distributor here in Knoxville. And Martha Henson inherited a lot of money and used the money to build this church, and also later to build Henson Hall at UT campus, which is unfortunately slated to be torn down soon. But this church is staying, as far as I know. But a fine piece of work. Next one, please. All right, here's St. John's today. It's right across the street from Old Gray Cemetery. Next one, Paul. And here's nearby there was still another church, Third Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue in the 1890s. This is also known as Broadway Presbyterian Church. I found reason to mention this lately on our Eugenia Williams tours, because Eugenia Williams' ill-fated marriage began in this church. She was married in this church in 1920. But this church has been lost. We often wonder why we have a first and second and fourth Presbyterian church in Knoxville, but not a third. Well, this is the third right here. But again, an ivy covered church, as a few other churches have been. It's interesting how training ivy can make a place look substantial and venerable. But that's what they did there. Next one, please. All right, here's the St. James Episcopal Church on Broadway. I've not researched that for this presentation. I've given talks on this church before, but don't have my notes in front of me. We kind of cobbled this together pretty quickly, but a nice big good-looking church from the 20th century. Next one, please. And here's Broadway Baptist Church that I mentioned earlier. I think this may have started the idea of the Baptist building more substantial churches than the little simple Protestant meeting rooms that they had first been building downtown. It's interesting, the Baptists built big on the outskirts of downtown before they did in the downtown area. Next one, and here's what Broadway Baptist looks like today, a very modernist building. All right, here is an interesting church, the Christian church, on Fifth Avenue. This is still there. This is believed to be the only project that George and his son Charlie Barber ever worked on. I don't know whether that's true or not, but Charlie Barber was very young in 1915, just starting his career, and I'm not sure he even founded Barber McMurray yet, but this was it was about that time that he did. And George Barber, this was his last work that we know of. He died after they finished the design, but before the church was dedicated. George Barber, famous for the Victorian architecture that you see, especially in the Park Ridge area and all over town, all over the nation. In fact, there are George Barber houses on the West Coast. But they worked together on this interesting church, which was modeled after a Stanford White church. Stanford White was probably the most famous American architect before Frank Lloyd Wright. He was based in New York. Designed a Presbyterian church in New York, which was more elaborate, had a dome connected to it, but part of the church looked a lot like this church, and that was the inspiration for them. Stanford White's church in New York was torn down many decades ago, but we still have this church. It's considered a kind of a fossil of that church, if you want to. One crazy connection is this church is near the very close to the St. John's Lutheran Church, which was designed by Mr. Graff, Richard Graff, who also designed Thaw Hall in Maryville College. Thaw Hall is named for the Thaw family who donated money for it. And Mr. Thaw was the guy in New York who shot and killed Stanford White in what they called the crime of the century in the very early years of the 20th century. So that's maybe stretching a point a little bit too far, but that's the kind of thing that I do on a habitual basis. But anyway, this is an interesting church. It was vacated by the original congregation after 100 years, almost exactly there. They added this wing, kind of a California style wing on the right for Sunday schools and other kind of assemblies and things. But they lovely church, both the original one and the wing. But they outgrew it and ended up rebuilding in the suburbs, as many churches have. And fortunately, this church was not torn down when they left. It's been used both for musical events. Big Ears used it for a few years, and I think it's been used by a religious group in recent years. But next one, please. All right, this is Central Methodist, and on 3rd Avenue. You may, if you live in 4th and Gill, you're familiar with this church. This is really you drive around the tree-lined streets of 4th Avenue, and suddenly here's this massive Methodist church. And again, the Methodists were always trying to build impressively, even sometimes for modest congregations, but often with urging from the national authorities in the Methodist Church. But this was this church was put together when the Broad Street Methodist Church burned down in 1924, which prompted a merger with another struggling Methodist church, Centenary Methodist. They got together and formed a big congregation and called it Central Methodist, and they called it Central. It was right between where these two churches were located. But built this new church in 1926. It was designed by Reuben Harrison Hunt, a Chattanooga architect who designed the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial in Chattanooga. And also younger folks who go to Atlanta a lot know that there's a place called the Tabernacle, which is a great big nightclub. And I think it started out as a Baptist tabernacle, but now it's a nightclub. But it was designed by the same guy, Mr. Hunt, who designed this church building. He designed that one in 1911 before coming to Knoxville to design this church building. But this is now a venue for lots of things. I know the Knoxville Writers Guild, among other groups, meets in this building as well. And the Nourish Knoxville has occasionally used it for winter markets. But anyway, we have one more picture, I believe, right, Paul? And this one's a little bit offbeat compared to the rest. This is a painting called Street in Knoxville by Charles Griffin Farr, a guy, and it was painted in the 1940s. Charles Griffin Farr lived in the Bay Area of California, and this painting's been kind of a puzzle, but we've been looking at this painting and looking at, like, there's something called Bell Laundry. You can't quite make it out there, but it's that blue sign in the middle is Bell Laundry. This was one in that spire in the background was the Lutheran church that I told y'all to remember. I think that's probably his imperfect memory in California of somewhere around 5th Avenue, which is probably where this painting, what inspired this painting. His memories of his childhood here in the 1920s is what he's recalling. But a fascinating painting. They called this magic realist before they ever applied that term to Spanish fiction. Anyway, a fascinating. Charles Griffin Farr, one of the most interesting and underappreciated artists from Knoxville, whose work is hanging at the KMA. He's part of our story that we're working with the KMA on their arts narrative. Anyway, a fascinating. You could do probably a 3 or 4 hour presentation about the church architecture in Knoxville, and this just kind of scratching the surface of it. But often our most interesting, impressive buildings in town have been churches over the years, especially since the mid 19th century. No questions at all? Anything at all? Would love to chat about any memory you have. Does anybody remember any of these churches that we saw, that massive Methodist church or others that are not there anymore? Well, all right. Well, I appreciate everybody joining us, including a few architects and relatives of architects as well on with us tonight. Appreciate that.